Evening, everyone. It's great to have so many of you with us tonight on another beautiful Seattle evening. We have so many of them in our summer and early fall. It's great to get to have you here tonight. A visual to help our people with low vision or calling in on the phone. I'm a white guy in my middle age sitting in my home office with my bookshelf behind me. And so that's where we're coming to you from tonight. And before we do get started, as we always do when we start a program at MOHAI, we want to remind ourselves that we are here on the lands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, and Coast Salish people, and we honor their endurance, their presence today. And I always recommend people to visit the Duwamish Longhouse and to learn more about their efforts to achieve federal recognition. And tonight, I'm so excited about our program because it does tie in with one of the most thrilling exhibits we've had at MOHAI in many years, Da Vinci Inventions, an exhibit that brings to life so many of these imaginative ideas, these mechanical inventions that were conceived by Da Vinci, but not realized in his own time. Instead, they were recorded in his notebooks and his codices, and Italian craftsmen of recent years have created them based on those drawings and brought them to life. It's an amazing exhibit. As Rachel was reminding us a little bit earlier this evening, you can actually touch many of the objects on display. So it's a terrific exhibit for families, and it's up now and will be up until the very early days of 2022. One of the things that I am reminded of about Da Vinci is that he was in many ways considered the universal genius. His passion, his curiosity, his explorations into nature and man, his holistic view of humanity really inspired not just the inventions that are in the exhibit, but inspired us as individuals and as cultures to think more holistically. And I think more than ever, that kind of thinking, that legacy of Leonardo is something that we need to value and to learn more about. And that brings me to the presentation tonight. MOHAI, as you know, is a Smithsonian affiliate, and so it's always a great honor to welcome a senior member of the Smithsonian Institution family to join us. And today we're very, very honored to have Dr. Peter Jakab join us. Dr. Jakab is senior curator at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. He has been there for over 3 decades, nearly 4 decades, has authored numerous books on flight. He's an expert on early flight, which goes back into ancient times up to the early 20th century. And along the way, he curated a very important exhibit, Leonardo da Vinci's Codex on the Flight of Birds, a really impactful and important exhibit. And much of the information from that exhibit, I know that Dr. Jakab will share with us this evening. Dr. Jakab was educated at Rutgers University, where he has received a PhD in American history and has spent the bulk of his career as a curator at the Smithsonian. And we're very honored to welcome tonight to learn more about Leonardo da Vinci and across the centuries. Please welcome Dr. Peter Jakab.
Okay, I think I've emerged on the screen. Greetings, Seattle and Washington. Greetings from the other Washington, DC. And I'm delighted to be with you this evening and share some thoughts about a subject and a historical figure that is endlessly fascinating and one that I think everybody can find something to intrigue them about. So this evening we're going to see if we can dive into who Leonardo da Vinci was and what he accomplished, particularly with regard to flight, and have a little chat about that. So why don't we just kind of jump in and begin? Of course, that's one of Leonardo's most famous images, the Vitruvian Man, and as really kind of really identifies the sort of pop culture aspect of Leonardo. We see his image of the Vitruvian Man on all manner of things, from coffee cups to posters and all sorts of things. So it really does, as an example of, speaks to how, in a popular culture way, Da Vinci reaches across the centuries. But in a more substantial way, Leonardo da Vinci really remains history's universal genius. The great figure of the Renaissance, he's the very definition of what it is to be a Renaissance person. His aggregate achievements in art, engineering, mathematics, anatomy, geology, physics, music, military technology, aeronautics, and a wide range of other fields not only stood without peer in his own time, but were strikingly prescient for the distant future. Leonardo's ideas were rich with insight and creativity, but also daring. In nearly everything he approached, he challenged conventional thinking and established a new framework for innovation. He not only greatly expanded knowledge, but he changed the way we ask the questions. Now, here's our hero, Leonardo. Again, an image that probably many of you have seen before. This is his famous self-portrait, although more recent scholars are starting to question that, whether or not that really is a self-portrait of Leonardo, or if it's something that he might have done imagining what he might have looked like as an older person. There's some question about that. I'm not an art historian, so I can't speak very authoritatively on the debate about this self-portrait, but it certainly remains representative of the iconographic image of Leonardo that we all are familiar with. That is Leonardo as we see him and as we think of him over time. But as deeply embedded as this characterization of Leonardo as the ultimate Renaissance person and creative thinker today, for 3 centuries after his death in 1519, the world's grasp of his legacy was much more narrow. Leonardo was generally known only as a painter until the 19th century. Of course, his most famous work, the Mona Lisa, and perhaps second only to that is The Last Supper, were how people thought of Leonardo as a great Renaissance painter. This painting, Ginevra da Vinci, is the only Leonardo painting that's in the United States. This hangs in the National Gallery of Art here in Washington, D.C. So again, when people thought of Leonardo for several centuries after his lifetime, they thought of him very much in terms of these paintings. Little or nothing of his sculpture survived, nor his engineering works. And his notebooks, the only remaining evidence of his insatiable curiosity and fertile mind, were long hidden away, dispersed in private hands, and were just not well known at all. It was only after 1800 that the record of his intellectual and technical accomplishments, the thousands of pages of writings and drawings that we collectively refer to today as Leonardo's codices, that began to surface, be studied, and published. So with the discovery of, or the rediscovery, I should say, of Leonardo's codices, the artist who painted the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper was recast as a Renaissance visionary who saw the modern world before it was realized. Leonardo was born in 1452 and died in 1519. So I'll give you a little time frame of his life. He's one of the most recognized names in history, but yet biographical details about him are few, and his personality still remains an enigma. Despite the survival of approximately 7,000 pages of an estimated 13,000 pages of notes he produced, references to his views on the issues of the day, personal reflections, or even basic facts about his life are only infrequently scattered among his voluminous writings on a broad array of topics that interested him. Leonardo was a person largely mute in what he left behind. We can, however, say something about the age in which he lived and the environments that shaped him. He was born in the village of Vinci, hence the name Leonardo da Vinci. It's one little kind of a pet peeve of mine when people refer to Da Vinci. That's really not his name. That's the place he came from. So we should probably refer to him as Leonardo or Leonardo of Vinci. So he was born in the town of Vinci. He was the illegitimate son of a notary by the name of Piero da Vinci. And Piero spent much of his time in Florence, leaving Leonardo to be raised primarily by his grandparents and his uncle Francesco, who took great pleasure from working the land and being a farmer and working in nature. Leonardo was closest to Francesco, and he acquired from him an early love of the outdoors and a curiosity about the natural world, which would be a consistent influence in his later work. A pivotal moment in Leonardo's life came in the 1460s, when as a teenager, he left Vinci for Florence to apprentice in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. Sampiero may have been an absent father, but he could not have done better by Leonardo than to enlist Verrocchio to take him under his creative wing. And that is Verrocchio, Andrea Verrocchio, who was a critical figure in Leonardo's development. Verrocchio was something of a one-person university of the arts. At the time Leonardo joined him, his workshop was quickly becoming a meeting place for all the artistic youth of Florence and a crucible for new ideas, techniques, and philosophies of art. Most importantly, Verrocchio fostered a new approach to art that was emerging during the period that focused on mastering nature in its reality, compared to a more inspirational approach to depicting nature in works of the past. One learned to draw from nature under Verrocchio's tutelage, and he was a pioneer, not satisfied with imitating the works of previous masters. That was the tradition of the time. He experimented, he improved, he challenged, he innovated. The scientific spirit of the Renaissance was at work in Verrocchio's shop as well. Leonardo and the other students were grounded in scientific principles of observation, analysis, deduction, and experiment, and infused them in their approach to art. Indeed, the distinction between art and science was blurred. This was the environment in which the young mind and the talents of Leonardo matured. Art as a foundation of engineering, and engineering as an expression of art. This approach was nurtured and expanded by Verrocchio and pervaded everything Leonardo did for the remainder of his life. So that was really critical to Leonardo becoming Leonardo. This incredibly fertile and encouraging setting of the Verrocchio shop. Leonardo would later say to his own students, quote, "You will never succeed if you do not have a universal power to represent by your art all the varieties of form present in nature. Indeed, you will find this impossible unless you can first see them and hold them in your mind. Science is the captain," he wrote, "but practice is the soldier." So again, this blurring of science and art and nature was critical to shaping the young Leonardo mind, and really representative of the era in which he lived. Not surprisingly, given the environment in which Leonardo trained as an artist with Verrocchio, we find in his codices many drawings and sketches of what he observed in nature. For example, we see a lot of sketches of plants and flora in the codices, animals of all sorts. We see drawings and sketches of animals, many drawings of dogs from different perspectives. I guess dogs were a favorite of his, like for many people. And again, just throughout the codices, you see many studies of animals. There are also a tremendous number of drawings of horses in the codices, and part of that is that reason for that is that he did an extensive study of horses for a commission to create a huge dramatic sculpture of a horse, but the sculpture was never completed by Leonardo, certainly as far as we know. However, modern versions based on Leonardo's designs have been made, but he spent a great deal of time studying horses in preparation to create what was going to be this ultimate sculpture that he had been commissioned to do. Here again are some other working sketches of horses in the codices. This one is one of my favorites. Really, just really beautifully rendered drawings. There's also, of course, the very famous Leonardo da Vinci anatomical drawings. Although not entirely accurate, he represented a view of the human body internally as never before. The detail and the understanding of the human body was something very that Leonardo da Vinci really opened up in a powerful way. And there are many of these drawings throughout the codices. He's perhaps almost as famous for the anatomical drawings as anything else that he sketched. But as I mentioned before, art, science, and engineering merged in Leonardo's world, and the codices are filled with drawings of forward-looking machines and mechanical devices. Again, for Leonardo, art was the foundation of engineering, and engineering was the expression of art. There are drawings of buildings and architectural designs. Here's an example of one where he's sketching out a dome of a building and how that would be developed. Mechanical devices that can convert linear motion into rotary motion. Here we've seen an example of that, which of course was critical for power generation in the day. Here's an example of a crane that he designed. Of course, becomes very important for construction and building and those sorts of things. Water wheels and Archimedean screws for raising and moving water, which was of course very important in Leonardo da Vinci's time, as that was the principal source of power in those days. Even mechanical conveyances. Here's a drawing of a cart, a mechanical cart, or a car, an automobile maybe, perhaps we might call it, to use a modern term. He was very much depicting mechanical devices and designs throughout the codices. But among the many subjects that Leonardo studied, the possibility of human mechanical flight held particular fascination for him. He produced more than 35,000 words and 500 sketches dealing with flying machines, the nature of air, and bird flight. These investigations of flight are scattered throughout the many Da Vinci codices and manuscript collections, but he produced one short codex almost entirely on the subject in 1505 and 1506, called the Codex on the Flight of Birds. And here is a picture of the Codex on the Flight of Birds. I have here a facsimile of it, just to give you a sense how small it is. It's just a very small book, about 20 pages or so. But this is what the Codex actually looks like in terms of its size. The document is written in Leonardo's famous mirror script, written backward and reading from right to left. Most all of his codices were written with this unusual mirror writing, as it became to be known. It's not really known why he did that. Some speculate that he was left-handed and he did that to avoid simply to avoid smudging the ink as he wrote. Others have suggested that there was some element of secrecy that he was trying to maintain in his writings, but we really don't know for sure what was the motivation for doing that. But it's really this extraordinary style of writing that he was literally writing backwards to produce these notes. Fascinating. Leonardo's interest in flight appears to have stemmed from his extensive work on military technology, which he performed in the employ of the Milanese court. So he was, not only did he have commissions to do artwork, but he also had commissions to design technology, in particular military technology. He filled many notebooks with countless sketches of weapons, military machines, and fortifications. They included a giant crossbow, a tank, a submarine, to name just a few. Here are some examples. Here is a design for a method of preventing people from scaling a castle wall. You can see the ladders on the right side there, and this was an arrangement to knock those down and prevent scaling the walls. And then coming the other way, here was a design of a device to get above the walls and protecting the attacking army as it was coming up against the castle wall. And here is one of the more famous Da Vinci military sketches for what we would today, in modern terms, call a tank or an armored vehicle. So many of his ideas really had a realization in modern times. As far as it is known, None of these devices were actually constructed, and the pieces that are on display in the museum there are designed or built from the designs in the sketches. So it's kind of great that we can kind of see them in three-dimensional form with these recreations of his technology. But again, as far as we know, none of them were ever built in Leonardo's time. They simply lived in the sketches in the codices. Leonardo's focus on military technology and tactics led him to the idea of aerial reconnaissance, using flight as a military tactic. And once engaged with the notion of flying, it became an obsession with him. Given his close observance and use of nature as a foundation for his ideas, emulating natural flight was an obvious place for him to begin. Natural flight being the flight of birds, the flight of insects, flight in nature as he would observe it. Most of Leonardo's aeronautical designs were ornithopters, which is simply a machine that employs flapping wings as a method to generate not only the lift, but also the propulsion of the craft. So again, emulating what you see in terms of the way birds fly with mechanical means. He sketched such flying machines with the pilot prone, standing vertically, using arms, using legs. He drew detailed sketches of flapping mechanisms, flapping wing mechanisms, and a means for actuating them. There are quite a few of those designs, and I'm sure you've probably seen it for them. Here's an example of one of his ornithopter sketches where the legs and the arms are pumping these levers to move the wings. Here's another example of a framework of one of these ornithopter devices. This would then have some sort of medium to create the wing surface. Here's a sketch of a wing of one of his ornithopters, and you can see the strong influence of natural flight, of the shape of a bird wing that was really kind of the focus of what he was trying to design. There are also other sorts of ornithopters. Here's an example with a series of paddles that were supposed to lift the machine vertically. And of course, famously, he designed a helicopter. Here's one of his more famous images of a screw helicopter, and the parachute. We see a design for a parachute in one of the codices. As imaginative, though, as these designs were, the fundamental barrier to the ornithopter is the demonstrably limited muscle power and endurance of humans compared to birds. Simply, human beings don't have the physiology to make an ornithopter a viable flying machine, and Leonardo would never have been able to overcome this basic fact of human physiology. But still, he was working in the world that he was, and again, emulating natural flight seemed to be the obvious approach to trying to solve the problem of flight. Interestingly, though, most of these avian mimicking designs predated Leonardo's serious study of bird flight, which we find in the Codex in the Flight of Birds, again, begun in 1505 and completed in 1506. And in this work, which interestingly was compiled during the same period of time that Leonardo was painting the Mona Lisa, we see some of his ideas and observations about flight that were more forward-looking and better known than the better-known earlier ornithopter drawings. So while the images I just showed you are perhaps more famous, they are really the less substantive in terms of really understanding flight than the later work in the Codex on the Flight of Birds that we're focusing on this evening. In the Codex on the Flight of Birds, Leonardo focuses on the crucial concept of the relationship between the center of gravity and the center of lifting pressure on a bird's wing. Here we see a sketch of that, and he's talking about that in the Codex. Also, interestingly, you see that drawing of a leaf there, Leonardo would reuse paper because paper was not, something as readily available as it is in our own time. So you see this often in the codices, that pages where he made a sketch of something and then he would reuse that piece of paper to make notes or do other things. And here's a very good example of that. He also explains the behavior of birds as they ascend against the wind, foreshadowing the modern concept of a stall. And here we see that not only in terms of the description of that, but also the sketch of the bird, showing how it reacts against the oncoming flow of air. He demonstrates a rudimentary understanding of the relationship between a curved wing section, curvature of a wing, a cross section of an airfoil, and lift. Again, looking at a bird's wing. He grasped the concept of air as a fluid, which was a foundation of the modern science of aerodynamics. Leonardo made insightful observations of gliding flight by birds and the way in which they balance themselves with their wings and their tail, just as the Wright brothers did several hundred years later when they were evolving their aeronautical designs. They also observed birds and tried to understand the role of how birds manipulated their wings and tail to control the aircraft. He also commented on the pilot's position in a potential flying machine and how control could be achieved by shifting the weight of the pilot, the body weight of the pilot, which was something that late 19th century glider pioneers focused on. So again, many of the things that he discusses in the Codex on the Flight of Birds really are foreshadowing how later experimenters would approach the problem of flight. He also notes the importance of lightweight structures that an aircraft would require. And here's an example you see on the screen where he's drawing. It's again mimicking the bird wing, but he's making a mechanical structural design for a wing, and understanding again that the weight of the aircraft is going to be critical. He even in the Codex hints at the force that Newton would later define as gravity. So again, we see so many concepts that he touches on that are developed by later experimenters that have realization not only in human flight, but in other sciences and engineering achievements. So in less than 20 pages of notes and drawings, the Codex on the Flight of Birds outlines a number of observations and beginning concepts that would find a place in the development of a successful airplane in the early 20th century, several hundred years after Leonardo's time. He never abandoned his preoccupation with flapping wing designs, ornithopters, as I said, and he didn't develop the insights that he recorded in the Codex on the Flight of Birds in any practical way. So we can't make a direct connection between what appears in Leonardo's work and a practical flying machine that emerged in the early 20th century. But nonetheless, centuries before any real progress toward a practical flying machine was achieved, the seeds of the ideas that would lead humans to spreading their wings germinated in the mind of Leonardo da Vinci. In aeronautics, as with so many of the subjects he studied, he strode where no one had before. Leonardo da Vinci, he lived a 15th century life, but a vision of the modern world spread before his mind's eye, and there can be no doubt of that. I'd like to close this evening with a short video. As was mentioned in the introduction, in 2013, we had a rare opportunity to get on loan from the Biblioteca Reale in Turin, Italy, where the original Codex normally resides, to have it on loan to the Air and Space Museum in Washington, and a display of the original Codex. We worked with the Italian embassy here in Washington, D.C. to acquire that. And the video that I'm going to show was created to go along with that exhibition. This was also a time where preparations were being made to launch the Curiosity rover to Mars, which of course was successfully accomplished in 2013. And this, as you'll see in the film, it was suggested that the Codex be scanned and put on a chip and placed on board the rover, symbolically taking Leonardo to Mars, which where of course it still resides and is still doing great scientific work. The video also has some further details about just the history of the Codex. It's really a fascinating story about what happened to the works of Leonardo after he died and how they ended up getting dispersed and moved and found again and sold and stolen and reconstituted. Again, it was for several hundred years before we really understood that Leonardo was far more than a painter, although of course a genius painter to be sure. So that's my formal remarks. We're going to start the video here in a second, and I'll be happy to take any questions after the video. And the video it's about 8 minutes long, so not terribly long, but I think you'll find it very interesting. So let's start that. Let's see if I can make it go. There we are. It was working when we did our test. There we go.
One.
Torino, the first capital of Italy. An adventure lasting almost 4 centuries and thousands of kilometers ended here. Today, one of the most valuable manuscripts in history is also on Mars, the last stop of a journey full of twists and turns through time and space. Leonardo died in France in 1519. His legacy passed through the hands of kings, collectors, merchants, and thieves. 7,000 pages of observations and discoveries were gradually dispersed, forgotten, taken apart, sold, stolen, and given away, including what we now call the Codex on the Flight of Birds. Now and then, there are fleeting mentions of it. It turned up in Milan, but Napoleon took it to Paris as a trophy. It wound up in England, but some of the pages were lost. Then, a rich and passionate Russian historian managed to recover and reassemble a large part of the Codex. Never letting it out of his sight as it traveled through Europe, he took it all the way back to Siberia. He decided it was a gift fit for a queen and presented it to Queen Margherita of Italy. The final stop on its long journey was Torino's Royal Library. The year was 1893. As luck would have it, the few missing pages were found. The complete Codex was finally reunited with its author, at least virtually, because the Royal Library is also home to Leonardo's famous self-portrait. Buon pomeriggio dal telegiornale delle scienze, puntata davvero speciale oggi. May 2011, a special broadcast of Leonardo, the science news program of the Italian television RAI, is dedicated to the genius from Vinci. The guest is Charles Elaci, director of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
Well, Leonardo is the ultimate genius. You know, as scientist and explorer, we always looked at him as the model of what he has done, particularly his treatise on flight. You know, and he basically put the foundation of us leading to traveling to Mars.
Charles Elaci took part in a symbolic encounter 5 centuries in the making between the great Renaissance artist and engineer and the head of the engineers in Pasadena, the ones who drove the science of flight all the way to a new frontier in our exploration of space. ecco il famoso codice del volo di Leonardo da Vinci. You can open it, puoi aprirlo? You could live through, cominciare a sfogliarlo, poi lo vediamo meglio.
This is amazing, absolutely amazing. Yeah, all the drawing that he has done. It's hard to believe that I'm holding, probably the most important document about flight.
Why don't we fly to Mars?
Oh, that sounds like a superb idea. I think we can scan this document, put it on a chip, and put it on the rover that will be launching to Mars later this year. So we'll talk with the Italian Space Agency, the head of the agency, to request from NASA to actually do that.
Vehicle reports entry interface.
August the 5th, 2012. Curiosity carries Leonardo's Codex. Self-portrait to Mars, digitally, on a chip. The first truly scientific study of flight is 18 pages long, written in Leonardo's notorious backwards handwriting on paper already used for earlier drawings. The notebook is so small that Leonardo may have carried it in a pocket. The date 1505 tells us that at the same time he was studying birds and taking notes on their flight, he was painting the Mona Lisa. The kite, the bird that fascinated Leonardo. This thinker, who flew over the boundaries between disciplines, whose genius ranged from art to physics, from anatomy to astronomy, had a great dream: to make man fly. From the wing of a kite, he envisioned that of a flying machine, but first he had to understand the secret of flight. Leonardo had long observed the water in motion, and he was the first to draw air as a fluid. In the Codex, he describes the concept of gravity. Newton would arrive to that only 2 centuries later. He identified the physical forces generated by a wing in air, and he was just on the verge of understanding the difference in pressure on the surface of the wing. But that's not all. The Codex shows that he understood how the kite maneuvers and changes attitude. He drew a pilot in a kind of a cockpit and imagined the movements to support the flight. He even devised the first airbag in history, actually a kind of wineskin filled with water to cushion the pilot in case of a fall. And who would have imagined that the pages of such sublime intuitions also contained a shopping list? There is a chicken that cost Leonardo 2 soldi, but right next to the list is his extraordinary prophecy. Piglierà il primo volo, il grande uccello, empiendo l'universo di stupore, empiendo di sua fama tutte le scritture, e gloria eterna al nido ove nacque.
Peter, that was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, sharing the video. And we've got some questions, but I'm wondering if I can start by asking you, as a museum person, from one museum person to another. We have a lot of people on our call tonight who are very interested in archives and artifacts. What was it like working with the Codex of Birth?